Have you ever imagined discovering that your entire life was a lie? That the person who slept beside you for an entire decade was living a completely false identity? That every conversation about money, every financial worry, every postponed dream was part of an elaborate theater? This is the true story of Marcus and Sarah, a couple who lived 10 years of apparently normal marriage in Seattle until a revelation destroyed everything they thought they knew about each other. What began as a supposed test of true love transformed into the most calculated and devastating revenge ever documented between a couple. Prepare yourself for a story that will challenge everything you believe about trust, love, and how far a person can go when they discover they've been deceived by the person they loved most. A story with twists so shocking that you'll question whether it's possible to truly know someone. But before we begin this curious journey, if you enjoy real stories that mess with your head and make you rethink relationships and human nature, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave your like on the video. This helps us a lot to continue bringing these incredible stories to you. And now, let's start from the beginning of this saga that changed two lives forever. Imagine for a moment that you discovered that your entire life alongside the person you love most was a carefully orchestrated lie. Every conversation about money, every shared financial worry, every dream postponed due to lack of resources. All of this was nothing more than an elaborate theater that lasted an entire decade. This is exactly the reality that Sarah Martinez lived without knowing, married to a man she believed to be Marcus Thompson, a modest systems analyst from Seattle. But Marcus Thompson didn't exist. That wasn't even his real name, the man who slept beside her every night was, in reality, Marcus Alexander Rothschild III. Yes, that Rothschild, heir to one of the largest tech fortunes on the American West Coast. Owner of a series of startups that revolutionized the artificial intelligence market, with a net worth that fluctuated between $2.8 and $3.2 billion, depending on NASDAQ stock market fluctuations. The story of this monumental farce began in 2014, when Marcus was 28 years old and had just sold his third company to Google for an absurd amount that tabloids speculated to be close to $800 million. He was exhausted from elite life, tired of women who approached him clearly interested only in his bank account, fed up with the fake smiles and self-interested friendships that permeated his social circle in San Francisco. It was then that he made a decision that would change his life forever. He would create a completely new identity and live as an ordinary person, at least for a while. What began as a temporary experiment transformed into the most elaborate and enduring farce in modern history. Marcus didn't do this amateurishly. He hired an entire team of professionals, including a former CIA agent specialized in false identities, a forensic accountant, and even a behavioral psychologist, to build the perfect persona of Marcus Thompson. They created a complete past, fake school records at the University of Washington, employment history at mid-sized companies, even falsified medical and dental records. The apartment he rented in Capitol Hill, a middle-class Seattle neighborhood, cost exactly $2,400 per month, an amount he considered almost symbolic compared to the $45,000 monthly he paid for the penthouse in Nob Hill, San Francisco, which he secretly maintained. He furnished the apartment with IKEA furniture, bought a used 2012 Honda Civic, and even opened bank accounts with limited balances to maintain the farce. But the most impressive detail of this entire operation was the fake job he created for himself. Marcus didn't just invent that he worked as a systems analyst at Northwest Data Solutions. He actually created this company, a phantom company, but one that officially existed in Washington's commercial records, with a small rented office, a professional website, and even some real employees who believed they were working for a legitimate IT consulting startup. He went to this office every day, Monday through Friday, from 9 a.m. to 5:30 p.m. He pretended to participate in Zoom meetings, created fake reports, and even simulated work-related stress when he came home. The salary he received was exactly $8,500 annually, an amount he transferred monthly from one of his offshore accounts to the joint account he maintained with Sarah. During those 10 years, Marcus lived so convincingly as a middle-class person that even he sometimes forgot who he really was. He genuinely worried when gas prices rose, researched discount coupons before going to the supermarket, and even suggested they save to buy a house when he could buy the entire block without even noticing the money leaving his account. Most impressive was how he dealt with the friends that Sarah knew. Marcus had hired professional actors, some of whom became genuine friends over the years, to play his work colleagues. They occasionally appeared for barbecues at the apartment, had consistent conversations about fictitious company projects, and even called him pretending work emergencies when they needed to maintain the farce. Sarah never suspected anything. How could she? She saw Marcus leave for work every morning, return at the expected time, bring coherent stories about his day, demonstrate real financial concerns, and live exactly as any person with that income would live. They made budgets together, saved, for small trips, and even had some discussions about money, all completely genuine from her point of view. But perhaps the most disturbing detail of this entire farce was the diary that Marcus secretly kept, documenting every lie, every moment. He had to improvise every time he almost gave himself away. Pages and pages of meticulous notes on how to maintain consistency in his false identity, including reminders like, Sarah mentioned wanting to go to Hawaii, show concern about cost, or pretend frustration with fictitious boss tomorrow. For a decade, Marcus Rothschild III lived as Marcus Thompson, and did it so perfectly that he created not just a false identity, but an entire parallel life. A life that was about to crumble spectacularly, taking with it not just a marriage, but revealing how far a person can go when they decide to test whether they're loved for who they really are, or for what they possess. And Sarah, who for all those years shared the bed, dreams and worries with this man, had no idea that she was married to a millionaire ghost who played at being poor. March 15th, 2024, began like any other day in Sarah Martinez's life. She woke up at 6:30 a.m., prepared coffee for 2, kissed Marcus on the forehead while he pretended to sleep, a habit she'd maintained for years, and left for her job as a nurse at Seattle Children's Hospital. She had no idea that when she returned home that night, she would discover that her entire life had been an elaborate lie. Marcus had spent the last 6 months meticulously planning this moment. It wasn't an impulsive decision. It was the result of psychological pressure that had been growing inside him like a pressure cooker about to explode. The farce that had begun as a temporary experiment had become a prison from which he could no longer escape. The turning point happened during Christmas 2023. They were at Sarah's parents' house in Spokane, and Marcus watched as she told the family about how they were saving to finally buy a house. She spoke with such pride about how they had managed to save $15,000 for the down payment, how they had sacrificed small luxuries, how they were researching cheaper neighborhoods in Seattle's suburbs. In that moment, Marcus looked at Sarah's radiant face, at her parents smiling proudly at their responsible daughter, and something inside him simply broke. He realized he was no longer testing whether she loved him for who he was. He was robbing her of the chance to dream big, to live a life without financial limitations, to help the family that clearly needed support. Sarah's mother had casually mentioned that they needed to postpone her father's surgery because of their health plan, and Marcus had to restrain himself from screaming that he could pay for the best doctors in the country. He saw Sarah discreetly check the price of a gift she wanted to give her younger sister, and had to watch her put it back on the shelf for being too expensive, $40 that for him was less than a tip. During the following weeks, Marcus began to notice details he had ignored for years. Sarah worked double shifts to save extra money. She mended clothes instead of buying new ones. She refused invitations to go out with friends because it was tight this month. She ate less when she thought food was running out, always leaving the best part for him. And worst of all, she had stopped talking about her dreams. The Sarah he had met in 2014 talked about traveling the world, about going back to school, about having children when they were more financially stable. 10 years later, she had buried those dreams so deeply that she didn't even mention them anymore. Marcus realized that his social experiment had become a form of psychological abuse. He was forcing the woman he loved to live a life of unnecessary privations, and worse still, she was grateful for it. Grateful to have a responsible husband who didn't spend beyond their means. The final decision came when Sarah mentioned she had refused a promotion at the hospital. The new position would mean more responsibilities and more money, but would also require her to go back to school, something that would cost about $8,000 in courses. "It doesn't make sense to go into debt now that we're saving for the house," she said with a resigned smile that broke Marcus's heart. It was at that moment he decided the farce had to end. But Marcus being Marcus, he couldn't simply come home and say, "Surprise, I'm a billionaire." He needed a plan. He needed a way to reveal the truth that wouldn't psychologically destroy Sarah, that wouldn't make her feel like an idiot for having believed him all those years. He spent 2 months planning every detail of the revelation. He hired a trauma specialist psychologist to guide him on how to minimize emotional impact. He consulted lawyers about the legal implications of his farce. He even rehearsed different versions of the conversation with a communication coach. The final plan was elaborate, like everything Marcus did. He chose a Friday so Sarah would have the weekend to process the information. He planned to reveal everything, in stages, starting with the truth about his identity, then about the company, and finally about the money. He had prepared documents, proof, even an explanatory video he recorded, in case he was left speechless. On the morning of March 15th, Marcus called Northwest Data Solutions and asked them to cancel any calls or emails that could interrupt the evening. He dismissed the actors who played his colleagues, paying each of them a generous bonus and explaining that the project had come to an end. He cleaned out the phantom office, canceled contracts, and officially ended 10 years of professional lies. During the day, he couldn't concentrate on anything. He reviewed the plan dozens of times, imagined every possible reaction from Sarah, prepared answers for questions she might ask. He had even written a letter explaining everything, in case she couldn't hear the complete explanation in the first conversation. When Sarah arrived from the hospital at 7:30 p.m., she found the house strangely tidy. Marcus had cooked something. He rarely did, always claiming he arrived tired from work. There were lit candles, a bottle of wine on the table, and he was visibly nervous. "Is everything okay?" she asked, still wearing her blue hospital uniform. "You seem different." Marcus took a deep breath. It was now or never. "Sarah, I need to tell you something," he began, and his voice trembled in a way she had never heard before. "Something I should have told you a long time ago. Something that's going to change everything between us." Sarah sat down slowly, and Marcus could see fear beginning to form in her eyes. She was probably imagining a terminal illness, an affair, a separation. She couldn't even begin to imagine the truth. "I'm not who you think I am," Marcus continued. And at that moment, 10 years of carefully constructed lies began to crumble. "My name isn't Marcus Thompson. I don't work at Northwest Data Solutions. And we're not a middle-class family struggling to pay for a house." Sarah just stared at him, not understanding, as if he were speaking in a foreign language. "My real name is Marcus Alexander Rothschild III," he said, and saw the confusion on her face transform into something that looked like terror. "And I'm a billionaire." The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah didn't move, didn't blink, didn't breathe. It was as if the world had stopped spinning. And then, slowly, very slowly, she began to laugh. Not a laugh of joy or relief, but something cold and brittle that made Marcus realize he had made the biggest mistake of his life. "You're kidding me," she said, and her voice had a strange quality, almost disconnected. 10 years of marriage, And you're kidding me. But when Marcus began showing documents, proof, when he opened the laptop and showed bank accounts with numbers that looked like phone codes, when he called his personal lawyer and put it on speakerphone, Sarah's laughter died. And what came after was much, much worse. What happened in the hours following Marcus's revelation defied all the expectations he had created in his mind. For months he had imagined scenarios. Sarah would be shocked, maybe angry, maybe even relieved. He expected tears, screams, questioning. He had even prepared for the possibility of her asking for divorce immediately. But what he never imagined was the icy silence that settled in the living room of the Capitol Hill apartment. After the laughter died, Sarah simply got up from the table, walked to the kitchen, and began washing the dinner dishes she hadn't even touched. Her movements were mechanical, precise, as if she were on autopilot. Marcus followed her, trying to explain, trying to justify, but she didn't respond. She didn't even look at him. "Sarah, please, say something to me," Marcus pleaded. "I know it's a lot to process, but 10 years, she finally said, her voice so low he could barely hear. 10 years of my life." She finished washing the dishes, carefully dried her hands, and turned to him. What Marcus saw in Sarah's face made him take a step back. It wasn't anger. It was something much deeper and scarier. It was the expression of someone who had just realized that their entire reality was an illusion. "I need time," she said, with a calm that was more terrifying than any scream. "I need to think." Sarah went upstairs to the bedroom and locked herself in. Marcus spent the entire night in the living room, listening to her cry through the door. They weren't dramatic sobs. It was a low, continuous crying, as if she were mourning. And in a way, she was. She was mourning the life she thought she had lived. On Saturday morning, Sarah came down the stairs dressed to go out. She had showered, combed her hair, and was wearing one of the nicest outfits she owned, a navy blue dress she reserved for special occasions. "Where are you going?" Marcus asked. "To visit my family," she replied, without looking at him. "I need to tell them that my husband doesn't exist." Marcus felt his blood freeze. "Sarah, you can't what?" She finally looked at him, and he saw that her eyes were red, but dry. "Can't tell the truth? How ironic." She spent 3 days in Spokane. 3 days during which Marcus almost went insane, calling constantly, sending messages that weren't answered. He even considered showing up at her parents' house, but something in the tone of the last message Sarah sent made him reconsider. "Don't show up here. I'll come back when I'm ready." When Sarah finally returned on Tuesday night, she seemed different, calmer, more centered. She entered the apartment, put her bag on the sofa, and sat at the kitchen table. "We need to talk," she said. Marcus sat across from her, expecting the worst, expecting her to ask for divorce, to throw him out of the house, to confront him with all the anger he knew she should be feeling. Instead, Sarah spoke with a strangely serene voice. "I understand why you did this." Marcus blinked, confused. "You understand? You wanted to know if I loved you for who you are, not for what you have. That's it, isn't it?" She tilted her head, almost as if analyzing a patient. "You were afraid that women were only interested in your money, so you created this elaborate test." "Yes," Marcus said, relieved. "Exactly that. Sarah, I love you so much, and I needed to know if I would pass your test," she interrupted him. "If I would be good enough for you." There was something in her tone that Marcus couldn't identify, but he was so relieved that she seemed to be understanding that he didn't stop to analyze. "It wasn't a test of you," he said quickly. "It was a test of circumstances. I wanted a real life, real love." Sarah smiled. It was the first smile he had seen from her since the revelation, and he felt flooded with relief. "I need some things from you," she said. "If we're going to move forward, I need some guarantees." "Anything," Marcus said immediately. "I'll do anything. First, I want total transparency. About everything. Finances, business, everything. No more secrets." "Of course," Marcus agreed. "Second, I want you to include me in financial decisions, not as a wife who receives an allowance, but as a real partner. Absolutely." "And third," Sarah paused, and Marcus could see she was weighing her words carefully, "I want you to transfer half of your assets to my name." Marcus blinked. "Half?" "Think about it," Sarah said, her voice still calm. "For 10 years, you made me live as if we were poor. You made me save every penny, work double shifts, deny help to my family. You stole 10 years of possibilities from me." Marcus felt growing discomfort, but she continued. "If you really love me, if you really trust me, then this shouldn't be a problem. After all, wasn't that what you were testing? Whether I loved you regardless of money?" There was a perverse logic to the argument, and Marcus found himself without words to rebut. "Besides," Sarah continued, "this would be proof that you trust me. That you don't think I'm going to run away with the money, that you believe we're really together." Marcus felt like he was being manipulated, but couldn't identify exactly how. Sarah's argument made sense on a superficial level, and he was so desperate to fix things that he was willing to accept almost anything. I need to talk to my lawyers," he said. "Of course," Sarah smiled again. "But Marcus, I need you to understand something. After 10 years of lies, this is the only way I can trust you again. It's this, or..." She didn't finish the sentence, but the implication was clear. During the following weeks, Sarah was the perfect wife. She was affectionate, understanding, even enthusiastic about the possibilities that Marcus's wealth could bring. She made plans to help family, to travel, to finally realize the dreams she had buried. But there was something in her eyes that Marcus couldn't decipher. Something calculating that appeared when she thought he wasn't looking. Marcus's lawyers tried to dissuade him. They proposed a retroactive prenup, trust funds, various structures that would protect his assets. But Sarah rejected all alternatives. "Either he trusts me completely or he doesn't," she said during a particularly tense meeting. "There's no middle ground." That's exactly what she said. No middle ground. And Marcus, blinded by guilt and desperation to save his marriage, agreed. On May 15th, 2024, exactly 2 months after the revelation, Marcus signed papers transferring $1.4 billion in various assets to the name of Sarah Martinez Rothschild. Stocks, real estate, bank accounts, even stakes in companies, everything carefully divided in half. Sarah signed the documents with a radiant smile, and that night, they made love for the first time since the revelation. Marcus fell asleep, believing he had finally fixed everything, that his marriage was saved, that Sarah had forgiven his decade of lies. He woke up alone. On the kitchen table, there was an envelope with his name written in Sarah's handwriting. Inside, a single sheet of paper with a message that would make his world crumble for the second time in 2 months. "Marcus, thank you for teaching me that trusting people is a mistake. Thank you for showing me that even love can be a lie. And thank you for giving me the resources to never depend on anyone again. You spent 10 years testing if I loved you for who you are. Congratulations, you passed the test. I really loved Marcus Thompson. Too bad he never existed. Now you know what it's like to be deceived by someone you love. What it's like to discover that the person who slept beside you every night was a stranger. What it's like to realize that your entire life was a lie. Don't try to find me. Don't try to recover the money. Everything was done legally, with your own signatures in front of your own lawyers. P.S. I always knew who you were, since the first year of marriage. I was just waiting for the right moment. Sarah." Marcus read the letter 3 times before completely understanding what had happened. He had been played at his own game, and lost in a way that not even his brilliant mind had been able to predict. Sarah hadn't forgiven his betrayal. She had meticulously planned her revenge, using exactly the same tactics he had used: lies, manipulation, and supernatural patience. And the worst part? She had done it perfectly, legally, Financially, emotionally, she had destroyed Marcus in Taiwan, the same way he had destroyed her. The only difference was that she had done in 2 months what it took him 10 years to do. What Marcus couldn't understand, while holding Sarah's letter with trembling hands, was that his story was just beginning to unfold. He thought his ex-wife's revenge was limited to the $1.4 billion she had taken, an astronomical amount, but one that technically still left him a billionaire. What he didn't imagine was that Sarah had planted seeds of destruction that would continue germinating long after her departure. The first consequence manifested that very morning when he discovered the note. When Marcus tried to access his main accounts to assess the damage, he discovered he couldn't. All his passwords had been changed, his credit cards were blocked, his bank accounts frozen. Initially, he assumed it was Sarah trying to make his life difficult, but when he finally got contact with his private bank in San Francisco, the truth was much more sinister. During the 2 months she had played the perfect forgiving wife, Sarah had used the access Marcus had given her to his finances for something much more elaborate than simply stealing money. She had discovered irregularities. Marcus had built his fortune legitimately, but like any billionaire, he had used aggressive tax avoidance strategies over the years. Tax havens, complex corporate structures, financial movements that, while legal, were questionable under intense scrutiny. Nothing that could send him to prison, but everything that could result in lengthy investigations, substantial fines, and, more importantly, public exposure. Sarah had meticulously documented all these operations and sent an anonymous dossier to the IRS, to the SEC, Securities and Exchange Commission, and to 3 of the country's largest economic specialized newspapers. The timing had been perfect. Authorities received the information the same morning she disappeared, ensuring that Marcus would be too busy dealing with investigations to pursue her. But that was just the beginning. Marcus discovered that Sarah had been even more meticulous in her revenge. During the weeks he thought she was processing the revelation and planning their future together, she was actually building a financial time bomb that would explode on multiple fronts. She had used privileged information about Marcus's companies for something that initially seemed beneficial. She had convinced him to make substantial donations to various charitable institutions. Marcus, still trying to redeem himself, had readily agreed to donate $200 million to various causes. What he didn't know was that Sarah had specifically chosen organizations that were under investigation for fund mismanagement. When these institutions were exposed in the following months, Marcus found himself involved in fraudulent charity scandals. His name appeared in headlines like "Billionaire financed fake charity scheme" and "How the ultra-rich use donations to launder money." Although technically innocent, the association of his name with these scandals destroyed his reputation in the elite philanthropic circle, a world where reputation is everything. But the coup de grace came from a direction Marcus never expected: his own family. During the 10 years of farce, Marcus had maintained minimal contact with his parents and siblings, claiming he was finding his own way and needed space. They respected his desire for privacy, especially because he continued attending important family events and maintaining his financial responsibilities within the family conglomerate. Sarah had discovered something that not even Marcus knew. His prolonged absence from family business had created a fissure in the corporate structure of Rothschild companies. His younger brother David had gradually assumed more responsibilities and decision-making power, and there was a group of external investors interested in forcing a complete company restructuring. With Marcus involved in tax and charity scandals, plus having lost half his personal fortune in such a spectacularly public way, his credibility as heir and business leader was ruined. David saw the perfect opportunity to consolidate his power, and together with external investors, initiated a movement to remove Marcus from all leadership positions in family companies. The board meeting happened in June 2024, just 1 month after Sarah's disappearance. Marcus, still trying to rebuild his life and deal with government investigations, suddenly found himself fighting to maintain his position in his own family company. David's argument was simple and devastating. Marcus had demonstrated questionable judgment in both his personal life and financial decisions, and the family could no longer trust him with significant corporate responsibilities. The vote was 7-2 in favor of Marcus's removal. His own parents voted against him. In a matter of weeks, Marcus lost not only his wife and half his fortune, but also his position in the company his family had built for 3 generations. His stock participation was maintained, but he was effectively exiled from daily operations and strategic decisions. But the consequences didn't stop there. The media had become interested in the story, especially after some details about his decade of false life leaked. The narrative that emerged wasn't of a man who wanted to test true love, but of an eccentric billionaire who had played with an innocent woman's life for an entire decade. Sarah, who had disappeared completely, became an almost mythical figure in the press.
Articles with titles like "The Nurse Who Beat the Billionaire" and "How an Ordinary Woman Outsmarted the System" painted her as a modern heroine who had avenged herself against a powerful man who abused her trust. Marcus tried to tell his version
of the story, but every interview he gave only worsened his public image. He sounded like a rich man trying to justify having lied to his wife for 10 years. There was no way to make this seem sympathetic or understandable to the general public. But psychological pressure began affecting Marcus in ways he had never experienced. He, who had always been the man in control, the genius behind multiple successful companies, found himself completely powerless. He couldn't sleep, couldn't concentrate, and began making increasingly erratic financial decisions. His personal companies, those that weren't part of the family conglomerate, began to suffer. Without his focused leadership, and with his tarnished reputation, several important contracts were cancelled. Investors distanced themselves. Partnerships that had taken years to build dissolved in a matter of months. By September 2024, just 6 months after the revelation to Sarah, Marcus had lost not only the $1.4 billion she took, but another $800 million in market value from his companies. His fortune, which had once exceeded $3 billion, was reduced to less than $900 million. Still an astronomical amount for any normal person, but a vertiginous fall for someone accustomed to the power that comes with extreme wealth. But perhaps the cruelest consequence of all was social isolation. The friends Marcus had cultivated in his billionaire circle distanced themselves, not wanting to be associated with his scandals. The people he had known as Marcus Thompson, including the actors he had hired, but who had genuinely become friends, felt betrayed and manipulated, discovering they had been unwitting accomplices in an elaborate farce. Marcus found himself completely alone, surrounded by what wealth remained, but isolated from any genuine human connection. He had spent 10 years testing whether Sarah loved him for who he was, only to discover that in the process, he had completely lost his sense of who he really was. And somewhere in the world, Sarah Martinez, now with $1.4 billion and a carefully constructed new identity, was living the life Marcus had denied her for a decade. But not even Marcus, in his darkest nightmares, could imagine what Sarah had really planned for the end of her story. Because the woman he had underestimated had one last surprise in store, a revelation that would redefine everything he thought he knew about the last 10 years of his life. On March 15th, 2025, exactly 1 year after the revelation that destroyed his life, Marcus Rothschild received an envelope that would change everything he thought he knew about his own story. There was no return address, just his name written in the same handwriting he had learned to fear over the past 12 months. Marcus was living alone in a modest apartment in Portland, a city where no one knew him, where he could try to rebuild some semblance of normal life. His remaining fortune was managed by third parties, while he still dealt with the legal consequences of the tax investigation. He had lost weight, developed chronic insomnia, and was doing therapy 3 times a week trying to understand how his life had disintegrated so completely. When he opened the envelope, he found something that made him question his own sanity. A series of photographs and documents that seemed impossible. The first photo showed Sarah in a Seattle cafe, dated October 2013, 2 months before they met. But she wasn't alone. Sitting across from her was a man Marcus took a few seconds to recognize. It was himself, but an earlier version, from when he was still just Marcus Rothschild III, the young billionaire from San Francisco. This was impossible. Marcus remembered perfectly when he met Sarah. It was in January 2014 in a Capitol Hill bookstore, 3 months after he had created the identity of Marcus Thompson. They had never met before that, or at least that's what he believed. The second photo showed Sarah leaving the Rothschild Technologies corporate building in San Francisco, dated September 2013. The third showed her at a gala party, one of many, that Marcus frequented in his previous life as a public billionaire. The fourth was of her talking with David, Marcus's brother, at an expensive Nob Hill restaurant. Marcus's hands trembled as he flipped through the images. In each one, Sarah seemed to be observing, studying, learning. And then he found the document that made his world crumble for the third time. A consulting contract dated August 2013 between Sarah Martinez and a Los Angeles private investigation company. The scope of work was simple and terrifying. Detailed behavioral and psychological analysis of subject Marcus A. Rothschild III, including identification of emotional vulnerabilities and relationship patterns, with the objective of developing long-term approach strategy. Marcus let the papers fall to the floor. Sarah wasn't an innocent nurse he had met by chance. She was a specialized consultant, a kind of elite con artist who had been hired to approach him. But by whom and why? The answer came in the form of a letter, the last thing in the envelope. Dear Marcus, if you're reading this, it means you managed to survive the first year of your new life. Congratulations. I'm not sure I would have bet on that. I imagine you're wondering who hired my services. The answer is simple: you yourself. Not directly, of course. But in 2013, you were going through one of your regular existential crises, constantly complaining about gold-digging women and fake relationships. You even commented to your psychiatrist, Dr. Richard Coleman, remember him? That you would like to find someone who could love you without knowing about your wealth. What you didn't know is that Dr. Coleman was a college friend of my ex-boss at the consulting company. At a dinner, Coleman casually mentioned your interesting case, a young billionaire who fantasized about testing true love. My boss saw a unique business opportunity. The proposal was fascinating. Create a scenario where you could live your
fantasy completely convincingly, while simultaneously allowing us to study the behavioral patterns of ultra-rich individuals. It would be a long-term social experiment, financed by the very funds you had set aside to find yourself. Yes, Marcus.
You yourself financed your own manipulation. For 6 months, I studied every aspect of your life. Your past relationships, your insecurities, your behavior patterns, your romantic fantasies. I learned that you were a brilliant man in business, but completely immature emotionally. A narcissist who disguised himself as a romantic, a manipulator,
who saw himself as a victim. When you finally created the identity of Marcus Thompson and moved to Seattle, I was already there waiting.
I had already gotten the job at the hospital, had already built my own identity as a dedicated nurse and ideal girlfriend. The meeting at the bookstore wasn't coincidence. I knew you went there every Tuesday. You want to know what's really ironic? During the first years, I genuinely began to care about you. Marcus Thompson was a better version of Marcus Rothschild. More humble, more empathetic, more human. I fell in love with the person you became when you stopped being a billionaire. But then I remembered that it was all a lie. That you were testing me, evaluating me, deciding if I was good enough for your real wealth. And that infuriated me in a way you could never understand. You spent 10 years testing if I was real. I spent 10 years testing how far you would go with your farce. We're both guilty of turning love into an experiment. The difference is that I never forgot it was a game. You got so lost in your own lie that you began to believe it was noble. When you finally revealed the truth, I had everything planned for years. Every move I made after, the apparent acceptance, the emotional manipulation, the asset transfer, all of this had been in my plan since 2018. But here's the part that will really destroy you. I could have exposed everything at any moment. Could have told you I knew who you were, could have ended the game. But I wanted to see how far you would go. I wanted to see if you would eventually choose honesty, or if you would continue lying forever. You failed the test, Marcus. You chose to continue lying. Now, about the money. You must be wondering where the $1.4 billion are. The answer will surprise you. I didn't keep any of it. Every penny was anonymously donated to organizations that help victims of psychological abuse and emotional manipulation. Institutions that train people to identify narcissists, that help individuals recover from toxic relationships, that research the effects of long-term manipulation. Your fortune is being used to help people who suffered exactly what you made me.
Suffer for 10 years. I didn't want your money, Marcus. I wanted justice. And justice for me was ensuring that you felt exactly what I felt, the complete destruction of the reality you thought you knew. As for my whereabouts, I returned to my
real life. My real name was never Sarah Martinez. It was just another identity I built for this job. I'm retired now, living quietly somewhere you'll never find me. And before you think about looking for me or trying some kind of revenge, remember that. I spent 10 years documenting every aspect of your psychological manipulation. I have recordings, emails, enough evidence to completely destroy any credibility you might still have. But honestly, I don't think you'll try to find me, because now you know the truth. You're not the victim in this story. You never were. You were just a rich man who decided to play with another person's life for fun and discovered that she played better than you. Maybe now you can finally learn to be a real person. Maybe, without billions of dollars to hide behind, you'll finally discover who you really are, or maybe not. Frankly, it's not my problem anymore. Goodbye, Marcus. I hope someday you understand that this was never about money. It was about dignity. The woman you never really knew. Marcus read the letter 4 times before he could fully process its contents. Every word was like a dagger, redefining not just the last 10 years of his life, but his fundamental understanding of who he was as a person. He hadn't been the protagonist of his own story. He had been the antagonist in someone else's story. Sarah, or whoever she really was, had orchestrated everything. Every moment of genuine love he thought he had experienced, every test he believed he was conducting, every decision he thought he was making autonomously, all of this had been carefully planned and executed by someone who was infinitely more intelligent and more patient than him. And the worst part, she was right about everything. Marcus looked at himself in the bathroom mirror of his modest Portland apartment and saw, for the first time in his life, who he really was. Not a misunderstood genius testing true love, not a victim of a vengeful woman, but a privileged narcissist who had turned another person into an experiment to satisfy his own insecurity. In the months that followed, Marcus tried to rebuild his life with this new understanding of himself. He donated the remainder of his fortune to the same organization Sarah had chosen, keeping only enough to live modestly. He began volunteering at crisis centers, trying to understand and repair the damage that people like him caused. And sometimes, on lonely Portland nights, he wondered if Sarah, whatever her real name was somewhere in the world, living the life she always deserved to have. The life he had stolen from her for a decade, while playing God with another person's feelings. The final irony of the story was that Marcus had finally gotten what he always wanted, a life without the billions of dollars that defined his identity. He discovered who he really was when he took money out of the equation, and the answer was more devastating than any revenge Sarah could have planned. He was nobody, absolutely nobody. Man, this story left me completely speechless. When I started researching this case, I thought it would be just another story about an eccentric rich guy. But as the details unfolded, I realized I was looking at something much deeper and more disturbing. The truth is, there are no good guys in this story. Marcus started as a narcissist who turned his wife into a lab experiment. But Sarah revealed herself to be an even more calculating professional manipulator. Both lied, both manipulated, both destroyed lives. But what impacted me most was realizing how money can corrupt not just those who possess it, but everyone around them. Marcus used his wealth to create a false reality. Sarah used her intelligence to steal that wealth. And in the end, the ones who really paid the price were the innocent, people who got dragged into this sick psychological game. The moral of this story? Maybe it's that when you play God with other people's lives, you eventually meet someone who plays better than you. Or maybe it's simply that honesty, no matter how painful, will always be better than the most well-constructed lie. One thing is certain. After learning this story, I'll never look at relationships the same way again. Will you? If this story made you reflect as much as it made me reflect, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It really helps me continue bringing these real stories that mess with our heads and make us question everything we thought we knew about human nature. And tell me in the comments, do you think Sarah went too far? Or did Marcus deserve everything that happened to him?